Stewart from OnlineChessLessons.net, and I'm going to be kicking off a new series here with this video. I'll be looking at the Najdorf variation of the Sicilian defense, and where better to start than by looking at two of the best players to ever play the game, Bobby Fischer and Garry Kasparov, two guys that really just had an incredible impact on the development of theory with respect to the Najdorf defense. So kicking things off, this game was Robert Byrne playing against Bobby Fischer. So Fischer's got the black pieces in the Sozin Zonal in 1967. So even though this game was played almost, it's about 45 years ago, I still see this line. I still see it pop up sometimes. And so you got to be prepared. And so Byrne here, this is the Najdorf, the Sicilian coming up with c5. Now knight f6 and a6. This is a characteristic move order in the Najdorf. And so the point of a6 very simply to keep a piece out of b5. So if you play e5 right away, I believe the problem is going to be bishop f5 check. Now, however, black is going to block, and the knight comes to f5 where it's going to have immediate pressure on d6. Black is in trouble. You definitely want to avoid that if possible. So that's why a6 comes into play now. And so bishop c4 here. This is the Fischer-Sozin attack. So I think Sozin came up with this bishop c4 move back in the day, and then Fischer kind of really added a lot to the line. And so bishop c4 just makes a lot of sense. I mean, you see d6 played here. Automatically, you want to start thinking, well, let's go ahead and start putting some pressure on this d5 square. So essentially, e6 is the move. E5. You'll see this every now and then. But I think, again, the problem, something move like knight f5, for example, and you can see the weakness of the light squares for black in the center is just not going to be pleasant as a long-term thing. So e6, this is the standard reply. Bishop b3, this makes sense. Bishop b3. Go ahead and get the bishop back, and it's a little bit more flexible as black will most likely either play queen c7 or b5 in the future anyway, and so moving the bishop makes sense. So b5, and this was really his way of responding to the Fischer-Sozin attack. And so b5 immediately, it just makes sense. While you are moving a lot of pawns, you are, getting some counterplay on the queen side very quickly. And a lot of times in openings like this, white might be trying to play like queen f3 to be threatening e5 against a possible b5 move later. So that's a good reason to play b5 early. Just go ahead and get the counterplay. And so with f4 here, this is called the flank attack in this Fischer-Sozin attack. And f4 is definitely one of the most aggressive moves here. If you're not prepared, you can get crushed pretty quick. As you can see, there's a lot of pieces going towards this focal point on e6. And if e6 is undermined, you might have problems on d5, etc. So bishop b7 here, it should be, bishop b7 just makes sense. I mean, you're putting some pressure on the center, just trying to develop a little bit, and also, controlling the d5 square. So f5 by Byrne, he's pushing ahead. Very logical plan. Everything white has been doing has been directed at pressure on the light squares in the center, and e5 is pretty much forced to avoid, too much opening. And so the knight goes back to e2. And in this position, it's very dangerous for black to take the pawn on e4. I'd really caution you against doing that unless you're 100% sure. Because even if, let's just say, just to avoid the real complicated stuff, let's just say positionally. Say bishop d5 or something like this. And if we get a couple of exchanges, I think in this position already, white has sacked a pawn, but look at this knight. And, look at his lead in development, for example. I think it's a very pleasant game for white. So it's just dangerous to snatch pawns like that. And so Fischer continues knight bd7, just a natural developing move. He's waiting to move the bishop, which I found quite instructive, actually, because it's kind of a subtlety in this opening. And really you see it a lot of times in Najdorf where if you can get the rook to the c-file very quickly, a lot of times you'll be threatening an exchange sack, and jumping on your counterplay with instant activity on the queen side, especially in the Najdorf, is usually a very good idea because you try to hit white before he gets totally set up. So bishop e7 anyway, no big deal here. And so rook c8, Now, after castles, in this position, this was kind of like kind of a starting point or whatnot for theory back in the 60s, I guess. And rook takes c3 is definitely something to try. Now sacrificing the exchange, picking up this pawn. It looks good for black, although after a4, white is definitely going to be having some good play. So black is down in exchange. So it's kind of risky to go ahead and sack it there. It is possible. Instead, if black castles, for example. Now this was kind of the main point, is that of white's previous play is that now he's going to exchange a pair of knights. And so let's say knight takes. And he's just going to play knight h5. And this is just such a simple positional plan, and yet it's extremely effective against the Najdorf, and it's definitely something you want to keep an eye out for. So let's say whatever, we throw in a check here, it's no big deal. This knight is, white is just succeeding in, he's accomplished a very favorable minor piece and balance. So after taking, you might be thinking, what about the two bishops? It just doesn't matter. The two bishops doesn't matter. Bishop d5. And, however, whatever you play here, it doesn't matter. Queen, let's just say rook c5. There's no way to buck this knight from the d5 square. And the knight, just think about how many squares in the center that this knight controls. It's controlling the game. And now let's think about this bishop. It's just out of the game. It's not doing anything. It's not flowing with these pawns at all. So that's just something you really want to avoid, is that critical, that knight getting to d5 like that. If white gets that good knight against a bad bishop, that is just the easiest endgame in the world to play. So instead of castling, this was Fischer's preparation. He plays h5. And this is not a move you normally see in the Najdorf, so it definitely took a little bit of creativity by Fischer, because h5 is weird. It's like it's a very committal move. You can't take that back. And but it doesn't seem to matter so much here, because the fact that black hasn't castled and he's used that extra tempo to complete his development, such as this rook here, it's flexible. Now the pawn coming to h5, the rook is actually going to participate in the attack a little more. And what it gives up is the g5 square, which is very difficult for white to get a knight to g5, for example, where it would be more active. So the bishop on g5, we know it's probably going to trade for the knight anyway, trying to undermine the light square control in the center. So h5, the point of the move, you can't just make pawn moves for this. You got to have a reason, is that it essentially forces h4, because there's not a good way for white to defend the e4 pawn. Let's say he does something like this, h4 right away. And now the pawn, it just seems is going to drop. It doesn't seem like there's really any way to defend the pawn, whether you're going to play b4, increase pressure. It's just too much pressure for black. He's got too much space there. So h4, and so the problem with h4 is that this bishop, the bishop and queen are just pointing right at that pawn. And it seems like that's just only the opening of the h file is only going to help black while his king is in the center. So here he plays b4, forces the knight to move. So knight comes to d5. And so now in these complications, the material is still even. White does have the critical d5 square under control, but the h file is open. And with queen g5, Fischer extremely resourceful in this game. The plan is just too good. The knight is kind of stuck. Where does the knight go? G4 doesn't do anything. You just lose the knight, and it pretty much forces f6. And so f6, if he takes this pawn, that would just be a horrible blunder. You got the knights. This is what white wants. And if you take this, I think simply taking here. And there's no way to stop this pawn from getting to g8. And it seems to be the same thing here. So instead, coming back, after f6, Fischer just plays g6. And so now the knight is kind of enticed into coming to g7. And, king d8, okay, this is all logical. Now the knight is kind of trapped here. And while, black's king doesn't have a lot of squares. White does control a lot of squares in the center. Fischer's able to finish the attack with excellent precision. So he starts by taking control of the dark squares. Knight c5, get a little activity. Byrne here tries to sacrifice his queen. And it seems like in this position, bishop a4 is going to be the move. Also possible, I suppose, is knight b6. I think the bishop a4 move looks pretty nice. And it seems like something like this is that it seems like white is going to still be able to keep playing. Maybe. I mean that's the idea, is that white can fight on. But instead, after rook h3, Fischer, he just continued logically, and he plays rook h4. And so rook h4 was nice, because now we're seeing a little bit. Rook h4 is nice because it's just closing down the h file. It's closing down all of white's activity. He's still got to move his queen. Taking the rook immediately would have been a big mistake. You take it right away, queen to h3, and now the queen, all of a sudden, white has still got a very dangerous attack here. But instead, rook h4, the big difference is just maintaining the tension. After queen f3, now he exchanges the bishop, rook takes. Now just a forced series of exchanges by Fischer, snatches the pawn, and now black forced white's resignation, queen f4. Yikes. He's just got too much pressure, and it just ties everything together. The rook can't come here and defend. I think if the queen moves, probably something like e4, that's going to work just fine. And this knight is going to be lost. Let's say e4, just for kicks, maybe something like this. The knight's going to be lost. So a really nice game by Fischer. Just to recap how he approached the opening, playing against kind of his own pet system, the Fischer-Sozin Attack. Plays e6, the early b5, the immediate b5, and f4. This is kind of the, I think it's almost a superficially dangerous line because of how Fischer played in this game. It's a very good example. So with bishop b7, just rapid development, e5 now, and going straight, it's all about the development. Rook c8, threaten the exchange sack, and h5 was the critical opening idea, now combined with very forceful play on b4, opening the h file. The rest was history. Fischer was able to finish the game very nicely. So moving on here, let's see what Mr. Garry Kasparov did. So this was Christian Bauer, Grandmaster, with the white pieces, and Garry Kasparov was playing with black here. This was the World Cup of Rapid Chess in 2001 in Cannes, France. And so Christian Bauer is a pretty solid GM. And, he was no joker, but Kasparov was obviously very well prepared as well. So with bishop b3 here, we're going to look at Kasparov's kind of his pet system. I don't think he originally came up with this idea, but he certainly did some excellent work on it, as notably in the 90s, 80s and 90s. Kasparov was playing this quite a good bit, this system, against the Fischer-Sozin Attack with knight bd7 and knight to c5. And so it might seem a little bit strange. You usually don't want to move the same piece in the opening too many times. Black has also made a lot of pawn moves. But what Black is thinking is that he's justifying his White's lead in development by the fact that Black is going to go after this bishop. The knight is protecting the light squares, and he's also going to be able to neutralize White's bishop on b3. So in this position, Kasparov does not play e5. This is very different. Let's say something like this. The knight is again going to be undermining. Now the d5 square is too weak with the knight on c5 and all this maneuvering and stuff like this. The knight is, let's just say something very, very simple. Now bishop to d5, just occupying the critical squares, and the knight on c5 is kind of out of play. So you don't really play e5 so much in this system with the knight on c5, as it's not going to be helping out with the control of d5. So Kasparov here, he plays bishop e7, and my first response, when I saw this line, I just thought it was a little too nuts for me. I was a little bit sketched out because e6, these e6 pawn just feels loose, and with the knight naturally placed to attack it, but here's the deal. I mean, Kasparov takes the bishop. So we can say right off, white has a lead in development. He has more space in the center. And maybe he's got a little bit of an initiative. But the thing is, it doesn't really matter that much. Because long term, black is going to have the two bishops. And this pawn, as loose as it might feel, is controlling, black is controlling all of these critical squares in the center. From f5 to c5, the pawns are all controlling it, doing a great job. So with the two bishops and this solid, his tight formation, while white, yes, he does have a lead in development and more space, it doesn't seem to result in much in this line because black's position is so compact and harmonious. There's no obvious weaknesses to attack. It's very difficult to attack the e6 pawn. In other lines, you'll see the queen coming to h3 to put pressure on it. It's simply not practical quite yet in this kind of position, and it would take a good deal of time. So king h1, and Kasparov continues an excellent plan for consolidating his pieces and finishing his development. Just taking advantage of the fact he's already moved the f7 pawn, and bringing the queen to g6. I mean, this is great. This is a very nice plan, very clean. Maybe black would like in the future, say if he could reroute this bishop to this diagonal, he would have excellent attacking prospects just based on the weakness of the e4 pawn. It's very difficult for white to protect that e4 pawn. And so moving forward here, white plays bishop g1, and I think he was maybe a little anticipating a little bit too much. He was thinking the knight was going to come to g4 and reroute to e5, where it'd be very strong, although not really doing so much. From e5, it's not going to be covering that many squares. It's just something like this. I mean, it is covering a lot of squares, but they don't seem to be that critical. It's not attacking anything here. It's just seems superficial to me. So instead, bishop g1, and Kasparov attentively opens the f file, and also the knight's trying to come to f4. If g3, again, maybe the bishop would reroute, and I'm sure this diagonal would become a little bit more important. So instead, bishop back to e3, guards the f4 square. And rook a8, and we can see perfect harmony, perfect coordination in black's position. And this line by Kasparov really seems to diffuse a lot of the insane complications that the Fischer-Sozin attack can offer. And so b4, this appears to be white's, I guess you could say, his decisive mistake, in that he's offering up a weakness now. This pawn is going to be very difficult to defend. So Kasparov immediately capitalizes. He trades rooks, plays knight back to f6. So he wants to bring the rook away from the d-file, just in case there were some tactics associated with playing e5 and the loose bishop on d7 in the previous position. So that's why rook takes f1, I believe. And so knight f6. Just go ahead and pick on that pawn. So bishop back, now b5. So playing b5 earlier wouldn't really have worked because the rook was lined up on the a6 pawn. But now if he plays rook a1, it really doesn't matter. It just helps black regroup. Let's say bishop c8. Bishop will be coming to b7 in the future. Also an advantage of having traded rooks before, this rook is still on the e6 pawn. So it would be helping the bishop move. The knight is not going to be able to take the pawn. So anyway, b5 fixes the opponent's weakness on b4. If white was allowed to trade that pawn, it would definitely not be weak anymore. And so rook f3. So now white is trying to get some activity. He's trying to attack because long term, it's not going to be very fun with these loose pawns on e4 and b4 against the two bishops by black. And so now queen h5, Kasparov really going to trade queens, and also maybe he's preventing e5 as well. So queen h5 is a nice move. So Bauer, he decides to he didn't want to play anymore for an attack and whatnot. He decides to try to hold a difficult endgame here. So rook c8, and it turns out there's not really any good way to defend this b4 pawn. And although these pawns, they looked loose all game, white just has been unable to capitalize on it because black has played with such straightforward logic. So now rook c4, and all of a sudden, what can you do? I mean, you move the knight, the e4 pawn drops, it's just not going to work. So knight a5, the rook is forced to a weird square. And after b3, nice move. You see this maneuver sometimes kind of in the hedgehog defense. And also you do see it in the Najdorf sometimes. Improving the position of the bishop on e7. Obviously its prospects weren't that good, but now swinging over to the queen side, maybe it's going to have a little more effect in the game. And so bishop c7, e5, sacks a pawn. Looks like he's going to get it back. And in this position, I mean, rook f4, Kasparov he closes the game out very nicely. So now gives up a pawn to get rid of that bishop. Now white's only down one pawn. Kasparov just makes it look too easy. b4, straight to the point. He latches onto the weakness of the opponent, plays bishop b5, a nice intermediate move. And here, I mean, what's he going to do? There's no way to hold the c2 pawn. Simply knight e4, black is going to get the pawn. So instead, Bauer tries to take, and Kasparov just makes it look too easy. b2 just marches the pawn right down. And so knight e4 was nice. Prevents bishop takes with threatening mate. So in this position, bishop d3, black is going to win at least a piece, and here white resigned. I guess because of knight g3, knight e2, and looks like he's going to lose a rook or a lot of pieces. I don't even know. So, okay, taking a look, a little recap here. So a6 indicates the Najdorf. e6, got to defend your squares. And so whereas Fischer had chosen b5 as his weapon of choice against this Fischer-Sozin attack, Kasparov also did play this b5 plan as well, but just to show some different lines. Fischer chose the b5 plan. Kasparov, he did play this quite frequently, with bringing the knight up to c5 instantly to neutralize that light squared bishop. And so Kasparov chooses to maintain these kind of floating pawns on e6 and d6, but by capturing the bishop on b3, as soon as he catches up in development, this was a beautiful maneuver. I mean, bringing the queen to e8, it's just so clear, so simple. And the queen, there's no attack there, putting pressure on the weak e4 pawn. And from there, I mean, in this position after rook a8, you can definitely say black has succeeded in the opening. He's at least equalized. His long-term chances are excellent based on the weakness of the e4 pawn, his tight structure, black's tight structure, lack of weaknesses, and also the two bishops. Definitely a nice advantage. So this is Will Stewart from OnlineChessLessons.net. Thanks for tuning in, and definitely keep an eye out for the DVD I'll be releasing to accompany these YouTube videos. In the DVD, I'll be taking a look in much greater detail at the preferred lines of Fischer as well as Kasparov and comparing how theory had progressed in their times.